welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Public Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am so thrilled to have the author Erika Lewis with us here again on the podcast. We interviewed Erika Lewis last year for her book, Kelcie Murphy and the Academy for the Unbreakable Arts, which was such a wonderful read. It really is like the female Harry Potter. Like, it's such a cool book. It had so much Celtic mythology and magic in it. Like,
thank you.
To entertain kids, adults, teens. Like, it was such an entertaining read. And then recently I got to sit down and read Kelcie Murphy and the Hunt for the Heart of Danu, which is the second book in the series, which has equally action-packed, fun, great reads. So I am thrilled to welcome back Erika Lewis. Thank you so much for being back on our show.
Thank you for having me. This is so much fun.
Yeah, so I love the character of Kelcie. I think that she's just so resilient through so many different things, that she's had to go through in the academy. And we learn a little bit more about her powers in this book than we did.
Well, she does.
Yes.
She learns a little bit more. I feel like it has to keep progressing throughout the whole story, right? Everything has to kind of change a little bit to keep it fresh.
Yes. So we found it in the first book that she's a Saga and she has the power of the elements.
Yes.
And in the second book, she finds that sometimes she's a little bit like has trouble controlling her powers and like.
Yeah. Well, part of that, in book 2, what I really wanted to explore without massive spoilers of any kind, is to break open the world that they're existing in. And for Kelcie in particular, it really means for her figuring out who she is. She had in book 1, we find out, obviously that she was abandoned and she just doesn't have a lot of memories. At least, she thinks she was, all these kinds of things. And she has no real memories. And so even though in book 1, she figured out pieces of herself and she figures out other things about herself, she doesn't really get to know the world she came from. So it was really important to me to both for her figure out who she is in this sort of, like we all want to figure out our cultural backgrounds. So for her, it's sort of exploring this fantasy cultural background of being a Fomorian, and also the world itself opening up,
Yeah, I thought that was so cool. And then she also has Athena that she has that helps her out in the series. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Did you get an inspiration from that, from like mythology of any kind?
So there's 2 kinds of families for Kelcie in this story. There's the one that she fell into, which is her clan and her Fomorian background and her Saga her elemental den mate, so to speak. And then there's the team that she was put together with, her sort of SEAL Team 6, although it's the Fantastic Four, the Fabulous Four. So there's only 4, but each of them are also, like with all of our friends in elementary and middle school, we're sort of coming into this way of figuring out who each other are, how to be better friends. And they, along the way, are also trying to help her because she's still struggling, especially in book 2, she's still struggling with trying to figure out how she feels about her father and about the situation that's happening without too many. And so, and her connection to him and what ultimately sort of is that her driving force throughout the first part of the book until they really figure out that something horrendous is about to happen. So
yes, and she befriends this character Lexus in the book, and I really thought that was so cool that we could see from her perspective in the first few chapters. So can you tell me a little bit about like her development as a character and why you decided to like write from her point of view?
Yeah, in book 2, the story really becomes about the war. It's less a magical school story, and much more about about these two lands that have been in this never-ending war, the lands of winter and the lands of summer, and this idea that both sides are sort of losing hope, that it's just continually going on. And I wanted to make sure that, in all wars, there's multiple sides. And I wanted to make sure that we were seeing all sides, and only really through these two sides getting to know each other could ultimately, a potential peace someday, ever be happening. So it was really important to me in book 2, in order to elevate the story, to sort of take it out of just being about the school and the bad things that are happening at the school, and make it really more about this war that was set up in book 1. I felt it was really important to explore through someone in the Lands of Winter's eyes, so we get both sides of the story. And Lexis is, I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but the nice thing I like about her from a personality perspective is that she's sort of the antithesis of what Kelcie was. Kelcie came to the school very nervous and afraid and didn't know anything, and was like, weary of every turn she made, and her powers are crazy. And Lexis has grown up in this world, so she comes with confidence, and she comes with an understanding of what's happening. And so it was fun to kind of go back and forth in the juxtaposition, and also sort of the secrets and spies of it all, right? Because it's more of a spy thriller a little bit in this.
It was so complex. Like, I loved like that combination of mythology, fantasy. I love how you develop your characters. And I thought that Lexis was definitely like one of the most like ambiguous characters. And still, as you're reading through the book, you still don't know like what exactly is going on, like her intentions throughout the story. So I think you did that really well. Like,
oh, thank you. Yeah, it's always really hard to know when you're writing whether you're giving away too much or too little. There's always that, like, oh, just tell them nothing. And then you get to the end of the book, like, okay, wait, that's too much to resolve. And then you go back, so with Lexis, it gave me the ability to sort of drop hints, which I loved being able to do, sort of what her sort of agenda was without giving away her agenda. So
yeah, and I loved how you developed the friendships too in this first story, because we got to see a glimpse of that. But like, everyone's like up for the task in this one. Like Verona and Niall, they've really grown as characters a lot. And
yeah,
so I really thought Niall has the disability too.
Yes.
So I love that you have a character like that in the story, and like, that is really, and you could see the development in this book too.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and that is stolen out of Irish mythology, in the sense that when one of their kings, Nuala, lost his arm in a war, he could no longer be king. And so it was really important, yes, from the representation standpoint, but specifically too, I this idea of a guy having to want to prove himself in this way, because for him, he's never seen himself or felt that he had a disadvantage by only having one hand. He's just always overcome everything. And I think a lot of young adults who are limb different in that way, they do. I've met and talked to kids that could literally write without any hands. They're amazing. So there's a resilience in him that was really important, because it's kind of the resilience that Kelcie doesn't have when she first gets there. It's sort of the antithesis of her. She's just sort of like, really out there for herself and not really a part of this greater picture that's going on. And yeah, his growth. I'm actually in the middle. I'm literally handing in book 3 this weekend.
Oh, so
for
exciting.
me, I'm like, I know where it's going. So there's like a lot of these pieces that are, now they're all rolling through my head.
Definitely, there's so much like foreshadowing, like what's to come. And like, I loved in this book, like there was action in the first book. So definitely for readers that haven't read the first story, there's plenty of action and magic. And we still see the classroom setting in this book. And if you're a Harry Potter fan, like the greenhouse, like the class is there, like it gives you like a different, like you don't really find a lot of books that you can like say are as good as Harry Potter, like compare, because like kids are always asking me, and I'm like, you definitely need to try this series, because there's so many comparisons and different things, but it's definitely its own series in its own right. And like,
well, thank you.
That gave me like that, like happy, like, oh, this reminds me of like Harry Potter, but it's like cool, it's its own story. And like, I'm glad that we still get some of the school, but then one of my favorite parts was like the sword, like when Kelcie does like the sword practice. I thought that was so cool, and like about the different mythology of the swords. Like, I don't know if you can tell us a little bit about that, like how you came up with that.
Well, the sword itself, the one thing about, and it stems from many mythologies, a lot of swords are famous and have names, they've been given names. And I did, this particular sword has, I don't want to give away too many spoilers because it's in 3.
Yeah,
but the swords themselves was obviously something that we find out at the end of book 1 that was left for her by her mother. And the swords in general, in this particular thing, for me, what was really important when it comes to, because I took a lot of karate as a kid, and I've taken a lot of these kinds of classes, and what I feel like is weapons have to be made for the person that are wielding them, especially, when you're talking about balance. And with this particular thing, I wanted there to also be that sort of mentor-mentee conversation, because having a mentor like Coach Blackwell is something kind of we all dream about, this idea that somebody really believes in her for the first time, right? This coach who's willing to do this and step up for her and really back her after having such a difficult experience her first year at the academy. So the swords themselves and the mythology put behind that particular sword is not, it's fictitious. There are swords that come in, and especially in book 3, like the Sword of Light and different things like that, that definitely play a role, but this one is entirely fictitious. And so without spoiling anything, it definitely has a godly flair to it. So for sure.
Definitely. And I wonder, besides the summer and winter that are in the main conflict, are we going to see more of different areas in book 3?
Well, book 3, so this Kelcie story is written as a trilogy, so it's not going to be like 5 books, it's just 3. And the story arc is about ending the never-ending war. So in book 3, not any spoilers, we are going to explore another part of the other world.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
But it will be with the goal of how can they finally end this never-ending war. And there's a hint of that in book 2. Obviously they hear something that sort of explains to them how the never-ending war is going to end potentially, but the rest of it breaks apart in book 3. So yeah.
How did you go about, I guess this is the middle book, so this was I feel like this is almost the hardest one to write, because I don't know if your experience in the series, for you, what was the most difficult one for you to write so far, you're finding?
This was
right. Yeah.
Horrendous. I mean, I originally wrote the first draft all from Kelsey's perspective. And, when you're on deadline, it's a crunch. And then I called my editor, I was 3/4 of the way, almost all the way through the book. And I called and I was like, yeah, this isn't working. In order to get to where we need to go, I gotta break open the world in this book, because otherwise we're going to have 5 or 6 books. And one of the things for me is I really felt like this should be a trilogy in terms of the arc of it. So I rewrote it, but that meant sort of pulling out different story plot points and rephrasing it all and really introducing winter. So I rewrote it. People are getting a book that has been very heavily paid attention to for probably 2.5 years of my life. This was a real thing to sort of break open the entire story, because there are a lot of moving parts. I kind of equated a little bit more to Avatar: The Last Airbender.
I can definitely see that. Or even, I was thinking even Percy Jackson is maybe
kind of, except for the fact that it's mostly in Percy's perspective.
That's true.
The one thing I think that I loved the most about Avatar, for me personally, yes, well, there are books about them now, so there you can definitely read it, but it was an animated series when I watched it. I felt like Zuko's character and some of these characters that were not just the Avatar had such brilliant storylines. In fact, I think Zuko's arc for a middle grade character is probably one of the best I've ever seen. And I felt like, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to explore everybody's backstory. Now, mind you, that means there's a lot of characters and it's a big world. And, especially as we roll down the hill till out of book 2, and I've introduced so many that when we get to book 3, there's, that, but yeah. So, yeah,
there's so many characters, but all the plot, the points, what's going on in the story, and you learn about these 2 different lands, and the whole, what's going to happen, in the ascension ceremony, there's so much build up to that, too.
There is.
And besides the fact that we find out about Kelsey's father,
yes,
being an outcast in the first story, then we get to learn more about her mother in this book.
We do, and we learn more about her mother and Brona's
Right.
also, and we learn more about, I should say, their family.
Yes, like not to go into too much depth, but yeah, that's like that's
We do.
yeah.
Yeah, and about how about the bigger picture of everything going on, and also, how Niall's sort of dysfunctional family has impacted, obviously all of the Lands of Summer, but also Kelcie's life and her clan's life, and it's got a lot of that monarch royal flair to it because of the Ascension ceremony, so we get a lot of that too, which is I always have fun with that. That's always, I love to watch that stuff. So. And right.
Yeah, no, it was so interesting. And then like I almost wondered, did you specifically look at like different parts of Celtic mythology in this book that you didn't like use as much in the first story? Could you tell us a little bit more about that research for this book?
Well, the way I step into research is I sort of research everything and then sit down to write and pull pieces that come to me at a time. So in book one, we saw a lot about the different, sort of the dens that
Right.
are associated with Celtic mythology. We learned about the stone circles a little bit. We learned about different sort of creatures and characters from the mythology. We learned about Skyhawk, who's actually a legendary, her principal preceptor is the actual real legendary warrior goddess, teaching goddess from Irish mythology. And then in book two, we learn about things like the Stone of Destiny. And, we just had a coronation for King Charles III, right?
Yeah.
We're on number 3.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of mythology around these Stone of Destinies. And I have my own theories about them. But if you go to Ireland, outside of Dublin, there's a place called the Hill of Tara. And on the Hill of Tara is a Stone of Destiny, which supposedly, which you learn about in this book, cries out when the next monarch touches it, the next one chosen by the gods. Now, the Scottish have a Stone of Destiny as well. That's typically in Edinburgh Castle, I should say, right? Edinburgh Castle. And for every coronation, it's brought down to England in fact, King Charles III sat on that Stone of Destiny during his coronation. My theory is that the Irish a long time ago loaned it to the Scots, and it's probably sitting in it. It's probably that's the real one, but there's multiple ones sort of floating around out there. So that specifically is in this story because we're talking about the Ascension ceremony, and we're talking. There's a lot of things that I fictionalize. I tend not to stick directly to as like, the Heart of Danu and certain things that are more made up. The Fomorian language is completely made up, stuff like that. But that Stone of Destiny is, it's also sort of what's the word I'm looking for? It's exactly what all of them are going through in this book. They're all sort of stepping into the beginnings of fulfilling a destiny.
Right. It's so cool and interesting, like how like mythology plays a background, like you created this own world in your own right with its own, functions and everything. But I'm like, oh yeah, that's special, like the Heart of Danu and the whole quest. And like we learned more about the different the Fiannas.
Yeah.
Fiannas. I'm still saying Fiannas.
I think it's pronounced Fianna. I could be wrong, but it's
Fianna. That makes sense.
So,
Fianna, yes.
So that's the way I go with it.
Yeah, and definitely more into the different clans, different families than we did from the first story. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah. And it's the fun for me with all of it is to try and tie it into something that's extremely entertaining at the same time of I grew up on Star Wars and massive obsession, and so this idea of having sort of this evil dad and that whole thing, there were like little things that for me really resonate all the way through and sort of combine all of these things that I wanted to put into it. But there's a character in particular in book 2 that honestly it was my favorite time writing, Swappy Toots, because he just I don't know, he just, there was something about him. I don't know. He just sort of came out of me and I was like, this character is going to be my favorite.
Yeah. I would say besides Lexus in this book, like the interesting, like definitely, I can't pronounce it, how to pronounce the name again.
Oh, Swappy's name?
Yeah, Swappy. Oh, Swappy.
Yeah.
Oh, Swappy. Yeah.
Yeah, Swappy,
Yes.
the changeling.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I love the new characters from the story. Like they were just like all like entertaining in their own right and like had their own place in the story. So they were just really fun to read too. I like there's like, a subtle like also like lightness too, because there is a heavy storyline, but it's like you also have like it's not like outward comedy, but there's just like, a lightness to a lot of the situations going on, like the characters.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's just a part of I think in some ways that's the best part of writing middle grade is that
Right.
you always want to find that happy place because in a view of all of us, before we hit high school, where
Yeah.
everything feels like the world is coming undone. You do try to see the best in a situation a lot of times. You do, at least I growing up that, nobody's life is easy. And when you take that into account, the comic relief is always important, especially
Yeah.
as they get really heavy,
Yeah,
And
and I like the chapter lengths too. It's not like overly like I find it's a very accessible read for like
okay. Yeah,
a lot
good.
of
Yeah, I
readers.
try to keep the chapters really short, even though
Yeah.
the book isn't short. Because I actually had in book one, I was visiting a school. I think it was around here, and one of the kids came up to me afterwards. And he was like, the first few chapters are really long, and my mom only lets me read for 15 minutes at bedtime every night. So in book two, could you just make them a little shorter? And I was like, okay, for you, I will do my best.
Yeah, I noticed that, like not from the first book, like they were overly long, but I really appreciated the shorter chapters, like because I find that keeps me reading, and like every chapter had its own information that was important to continue on, but it was just like that was great. Like,
Okay, good. Yeah,
yeah,
I tried really hard because it's when you're learning to read, I feel like you kind of gravitate from almost like graphic novels and illustrated books up to these books that are longer. And if you can keep the chapters shorter, it's I don't know. I mean, even as an adult reader, I appreciate chapters that aren't 25 pages long.
yeah. We have a big fantasy base of readers in our library and our community here.
Oh,
So
wow.
definitely I could see the kids like really enjoying this book in the series and the first book, like definitely to recommend to them because they are looking for the stories that like it's not like it's a perfect length too, and it has enough action. I think they like a lot of the fantasy stories that are more action packed and like have good
Yeah.
characters, and if they're looking for those kinds of books. And it's like always thinking like, oh, they're saying like, oh, I like this book, and I can't think of a great like read alike book, and then this is definitely a great read alike book for them, and I think
Oh,
there's
great.
like a lot of interest out of it. I don't know if you can give us a little bit of not a spoiler but just a hint of what's to come in the next book.
Oh, and book three?
Book three, yeah.
Oh, wow. Book three is a very epic ending to the never-ending war. It is about whether the lands of summer and the lands of winter are going to find a way to make peace. And it's going to have to be these two Fionas that have sort of started things in book two. It's going to be up to them to really have to finish it. And so without too many spoilers, it is it's a bit of a gut-wrenching one in the sense that there's a lot of character storylines that have to wrap up, and have to sort of including the whole storyline with Kelcie and her dad. So there's a lot of that has to come out.
Yes, they're still wondering about that, after
There's
reading.
a lot.
Still have
Oh,
a
yeah.
lot yet to learn. So
Yes, and that a lot of what happens in book three was all the stuff that was triggered in book two. So every little piece sort of folded in to how we get to the journey in book three, even though it's its own journey in its own right. So it's it's a little heavier in tone. I'm trying to keep it light,
Okay, but it
But
is the final conclusion to
it is
everything.
the final conclusion. It's not the Deathly Hallows, but it does definitely have a darker tone to it, because there's all these things confronting. So,
And you said that
yeah.
this book was the hardest to write. But did you have a favorite scene or scene that you most enjoyed writing for this book? I'm just curious.
What's my favorite scene? Oh my gosh, there were so many in this. I really liked writing the scene with the aria in the Lands of Winter.
Oh yeah,
It was just like really, that was really cool for me to sort of invent that whole world. And I liked toying around with wyverns. So all of the scenes with the wyverns, especially in the opening chapters, were really fun for me because they're kind of like dragons, but not dragons. And so you didn't really want to have dragons in the story, but I love wyverns and, sort of stole those from Welsh mythology. It's all good. So those scenes, but yeah, I love the scene with the aria. And then I also really enjoyed writing the scenes in Chawwell Woods with Kelcie when she, without too many spoilers,
well,
but
that
when
was
she's
so cool. Yeah.
discovering more about her, her family life, seeing people and herself and all the horrific things that they've been living with for all these years.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, whenever Kelcie like learns more about like her family and her background, like it's always like an interesting, like you always create like an interesting ambiance. Like it's hard to describe. Like it really draws the reader in, and it's like just
Oh,
like an
thank you.
interesting character. I feel like she's so well developed. Like not that all fantasy characters aren't, but there's something like so relatable about her, like, that I think a lot of kids, adults, teens, like they could all relate to in her character. So I think that was a big accomplishment. And there's more to come in the story. So you can see, like, can't wait to continue to read more about her and can't wait to read the next book, book 3. But book 2 is definitely one that people have to go out and read. It's going to be a great read for them. Even if they didn't read the first book, you leave enough, like you catch up anyone, even if you're coming into the story the first time, you can always go back and read the first book, but you could read this book on your own and be able to follow what's going on and everything. Like you gave us enough there was enough included in the first book, in the second book that you would know what was going on with the characters. So
yeah. And for anyone who read the first book, and that's I also, it's like a nice, I try to do short reminders so that the book doesn't end up really long. But you kind of want that because, the books come out every year. And so, it's been a little while since the first one came out. So if anybody read it right away, it's like, oh, I can't remember everything. But we catch you up pretty quick. So, yeah.
Is there anything that readers should pay attention to or like keep an eye on in book 2 that might become important later on without too many spoilers? Or
I think the scenes that happen in the Lands of Winter are probably the most important scenes that play through to book 3. There's also there isn't, the one thing I tried really hard to do, and I always try to do this, is not to leave a book on a cliffhanger ending, because that makes me a little nuts personally. Like I just want to throw it against the wall. And we tend to in young adults, like YA and in others, a lot of times leave, they're like, how could you leave them hanging from a rope about to die? So I tried to really give a satisfying, not cliffhanger ending on this, but there's a slight cliffhanger ending when it comes to Kelcie's dad. And those are really, so the back third of the book is really all the stuff that's going to push more towards book 3. So.
Oh, very exciting. Well, can't wait. And everyone needs to read the second book in the Kelcie Murphy series, Kelcie Murphy and the Hunt for the Heart of Danu. And what is the official release date?
July 25th.
July 25th?
Yes, that's like
on July 25th. So yeah, everyone go out and read Erika Lewis's new book in the series. It was so nice talking with you again about the series. Like I really love the series a lot. So
thank you.
Yeah, and I can't wait to know more. Oh, well, thanks for joining us on Turn the Page. As our special guest today was Erika Lewis, and Kelcie Murphy and the Hunt for the Heart of Danu is due out July 25th.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me,
Erika.
it's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.